light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I wanted to share a few thoughts on the broad topic, I guess, of sacred space. It's interesting as we look at the range of different religions that humanity has created over time, how many different ways the very notion of sacred space has been created. In the biblical stories, of course, it goes all the way down to the basic of Moses at the burning bush, being instructed, remove your shoes because the place where you're standing is holy ground. It was a field next to a bush that, for whatever reason, God chose to use that bush as a mouthpiece, as a point of focus. Supposedly the bush looked like it was on fire, but it wasn't consumed. There was some kind of ball of energy in that bush that was so bright it looked like flames, but the bush wasn't consumed. And of course, when the conversation was done, then the ball of fire within the bush disappeared. And Moses knew that he had been speaking with God during that time. The point, I guess, of all sacred space is that it involves the presence of the divine. Whether one conceives of the divine as masculine, as feminine, as energy, as consciousness, as the perfect balance of the universe, whatever conception, the idea of sacred space is that in some sense there is the presence of something divine there, something that is beyond humanity, something that is mysterious and wondrous and awe-inspiring. I think when people experience this deep, all-consuming awe, there is something of God in it. And for some people, that may be looking through the Hubble telescope. For other people, it may be an experience that comes for no apparent reason after hours of prayer or hours of meditation. It may come upon seeing a magnificent vista, stepping forward and looking over the Grand Canyon for the first time. And the only word that comes to mind is wow. And you are so filled with awe that there's a sense in which you feel very small, perhaps, and also a sense in which one feels part of what one perceives, a sort of awareness of relationship that in looking upon the Grand Canyon, for example, one is a witness to the beauty that one sees. It could be seeing a beautiful sunset, and in that moment deeply feeling the honor of being a witness to that beauty that is momentarily painted across the sky, and that in as little as 5 minutes the colors may fade and be gone. It doesn't make them any less real. It just means that they existed only within that very brief moment. And during that brief moment, you may have been one of thousands of people who actually got to see it because the others were too busy dealing with their daily lives or inside watching television or something. And they weren't outside where they could see the beauty of the sunset for the few moments that it lasted. And so, in a sense, you take that memory, that perception, that deep feeling of awe with you, and it becomes part of who you are and expands who you are. And that ultimately, to me, is the purpose of sacred space, to create relationship between ourselves and that which is beyond us, to create abilities and capacities for love and wisdom that exceed anything we've known up to that point. In reflecting on my own spiritual journey, my own life path, through a huge number of different churches and worship spaces through which I've journeyed, which I've seen at different times, in a more traditional sense, there are all the churches with, some of them with incredible architecture, some of them very old, some of them very new, some of them very simple, and the architecture of the sacred space was not so much the container as it was the architecture of what would happen with the spirits of the people when a worship service was occurring there. Which is to say, there are some churches that I've seen that were essentially just a big carpeted room with a stage up front, nothing else. But during a church service, the organic architecture of the space would be the presence of hundreds of people focusing their thoughts and hearts on transcendent spirituality, singing in unison, in some cases swaying or even dancing a little bit in the church, in their seats. Because in some of them there weren't even church pews; they were just rows of chairs. So you'd have the congregation or the audience, you'd have a certain number of worship leaders, musicians, and so forth up on the stage, and it was as if the spirits of the people created a temporary architecture, kind of like the colored clouds in the sunset, that they were there for a certain period of time and then they left to go other places and to do other things. But for the moment they were there, their interaction, the interaction of the clouds and the sun and the humidity and the landscape, creates a configuration of sacred space that may be temporary, but it is not for that reason less real. In other cases, people wanted to make the sense of sacredness more permanent, more infused into the building itself. I grew up within a Roman Catholic context, and in retrospect, it's kind of interesting how in your more traditional Catholic churches and cathedrals, frequently people do not need to be told to whisper upon entering, because there is something about the architecture that communicates reverence, that communicates sacredness and transcendence. The high vaulted ceilings, the arches, the stained glass windows, the dimly lit space with a few strategically placed candles. There's something about it that just says reverence. If you don't know anything about God, if you don't know anything about religion or theology, you can still walk into these spaces, kneel down, sit down, and just be quiet and look around and listen and feel the presence of something greater than yourself. And, to me, growing up in a Catholic setting, I never really had much use for the politics of the priest or the fact that one of them smoked really smelly cigars all the time. Whatever, if that's what he likes, I don't, but whatever. I didn't have much use for the priest, so to me they were never really the heart of Catholicism. To me, the heart of Roman Catholicism was the worship, was the reverence, the thundering pipe organs, the incense, the pageantry of processions and theatrical vestments and grand rituals. There was something about all of that that spoke of meaning and symbolism and color and form, and this totally invisible side of life that was intended to have this very constructive influence, even guidance, upon all the material side of life. That how we deal with material things should be a reflection of how we deal with spiritual things. And it always bothered me when there seemed to be a disconnect between the two. When I saw people on Sunday who, as soon as the church service ended, would jump up from their pews and race out of the church, jump in their cars, and rush off again, as if to say, I've done my duty, I'm done with the church till next Sunday. And it seemed unlikely to me that the music and the artistry of the ritual we had just shared had any lasting effect on their lives. I mean, it seemed like it didn't last any longer than the final amen of the service. It always bothered me too in the Catholic Church in which I was raised that no one seemed to know the stories of the people depicted in the stained glass windows. I thought they were beautiful works of art, and I want to know, so there's a person doing this with that, and there's a person standing under a tree over here. What does that mean? And it always kind of bugged me that the adults didn't know. And I thought, well, this is the church in which you're raising me. Shouldn't you know what the symbols mean? It's like saying, it would be like having an address and receiving mail and never opening it. Or what's a better example? Getting a letter from someone whom you've never met and not concerning yourself with who wrote the letter, but only with how it's nice to receive letters. But if it says anything more than greetings, I hope you're having a great week. It rained yesterday. The flowers in my garden are blooming beautifully. That somehow that would be enough for them. If it were me, I would want to know, well, that's all very well and good. What do you like? What has your life experience been? What are you learning? How are you growing? What's changing in your life? Are you still, what do you do to earn an income, to provide food, clothing, and shelter for yourself? Who are your relatives, and how do you get along with them? I want to know the whole person. In a similar sort of way, in coming to sacred space, I don't want a superficial experience. If I'm going to come to a space that is dedicated to being spiritual, to a relationship between the physical and the spiritual, between the material and the invisible, I want to know that something happened when I was there. I don't want to walk in and walk out without being affected. In the world of the theater, I sometimes describe this as the question of whether or not an actor or actress has done his or her job. If you perform in a play and you say the lines and you do the actions that the director has prescribed, and the audience comes in, watches, smiles, laughs, applauds, walks out, and is completely unchanged, I think the actor or the actress has not done his or her job. The point of a play is to affect life, to give insight, to change people, so that when you, for example, going to see, I remember when I was living in New York City and the movie Chariots of Fire was released. And I remember hearing everyone just going on and on and on about how wonderful it was, and I kind of said, well, okay, I guess I should go see it for myself. And I remember going to see this movie and being so captivated by the honesty of the human struggle it depicted and the beauty of the landscapes in which the story was set, that a couple hours later when the movie ended, it was as if I had completely forgotten that I was in New York City. I completely forgot where I was. I completely forgot that it was just a movie. It's as if for those 2 hours, the actors and actresses in that movie did such a good job, and their performance was so compelling that I really was not even in control of my own emotions, but I was feeling emotions based on what I was perceiving, and obviously having opportunity to respond to it, but by being presented with such a compelling performance, also finding myself reacting to it. And in that sense, it really empowered my self-awareness and helped me to expand my sense of who I was. and how even in the midst of New York City, a concrete jungle of sorts, one might say, that here was this window onto a totally green, lush, rural sort of small town life in another country. Um, looking at depictions of Scotland and so forth. And it was all so beautiful. And that beauty within the movie theater, some would say, was totally artificial. It was just a projection on the screen. And yet, for my experience of that movie, watching it, it was all completely real. And so while it wasn't geographically real, I would say that it was emotionally real. And perhaps in some sense even a little bit spiritually real. And that, I think, is what we're reaching for with sacred space, to make something spiritually real, whether or not it is geographically real, scientifically real, whatever. It's not about being able to prove it in every other conceivable way. It's about how you become a better person by being within that space in a particular way. And if you are within any space and it does not move you to become a better person, I question whether you have experienced that space in the way that this space deserves. In any case, in reflecting on the idea of sacred space and how I could bring the honesty and truth of myself to that, regardless of what other people were or were not doing, how to be present with God, whether I ever understood God, whether God remains divine mystery, masculine, feminine, both or neither, that there is some sense of personhood to God to which I choose to continue to relate, and which I continue to find empowering. And I don't need to be dogmatic about how it's supposed to look or how it's supposed to be or what you say or don't say. God and I can have that conversation and decide what's appropriate for the two of us. And it may not be appropriate for anybody else, but for the two of us it seems to work. And of course it changes with time too. But the point is not how the space is defined. I mean, for the pagans, there's also casting a circle. You can cast a circle virtually anywhere, so that any place could become sacred space, simply by going through some sort of ritual envisioning or action where you declare for this amount of time this space is sacred because of the focus that I'm bringing to this space, because of the activity I'm going to do within this space, because of the love and wisdom that I invite to be present within this space. Putting all of that together, I came up with a song which I've entitled Cathedral of the Heart, and I'd like to share it with you now. Yellow bricks and steeple high contain the worship space. At other times I met with God in a wild and wooded place. Yet the home that God likes most of all, I knew right from the start, travels with each one everywhere, the Cathedral of the Heart. There the music rolls like thunder, with rainbows all around, and God and I together are all that can be found. A healing light that fills the space as our dance goes on and on. The cathedral of my heart is where love lets me sing my song. From time to time I build a space with candle, cup, and sphere, crosses, stars, and painted things that cannot bring God near. But the call that brings that sacred one more quickly than I know is when with openness and honesty my cathedral spirit shows. There the music rolls like thunder, with rainbows all around, and God and I together are all that can be found. A healing light that fills the space as our dance goes on and on. The cathedral of my heart is where love lets me sing my song. The cathedral of my heart is where love lets me sing my song. One of my most favorite verses in the Bible is that which says that God is love. The one who doesn't love doesn't know God, and God doesn't know him. So wherever it's genuinely love, God is there. And, I suppose especially as a gay man, that so comes home, that when my love is genuine, when it's about giving, when it's about expanding, when it's about including, when it's about valuing the other person's happiness even more than my inclusion in it, when love is unconditional, that there is something of God in that, that as a little spark of the divine perhaps, I could even be a channel for God's presence to be somewhere. That I could be the welcome mat, the invitation, the conduit for God to be present, especially in those moments where God seems most absent. I think sometimes when God seems absent, it's because God is within us wanting to get out, and we don't necessarily let God out. Am I God? Maybe there's a connection, maybe there's a similarity, but I suppose to use a particular metaphor, I may be a glass of water, but God is the ocean. There's something in common, I suppose, but God, by definition, is beyond human comprehension, and for the limited human intellect, mostly wrapped in mystery, but not for that reason something that we can never experience. So, when I don't know what else to say, I just invite God to be real in me and through me and before me in whatever way God knows to be best. I invite you to always leave room for sacred space in your life, so that that which is beyond you, in whatever way is best for you and for whatever's around you, that you can enjoy that positive relationship with the transcendent as well. That you can know whether you believe in the God the Church proclaims or not, that there is something that is God, that is love, that is wisdom, and that is present, and that is available. I worry sometimes with some people's obsession with sacred texts, that it may be akin to receiving a letter from someone and being so enthralled with that letter that when the person comes to the door and rings the doorbell and knocks on the door and calls through the window, "I'm here, I would really love to talk to you," and the person responds, "I can't talk to you now, I'm reading your letter," and never recognizing who is at the door. never recognizing that within whichever space you experience to be sacred, that there is something mysterious and wonderful and transcendent and magnificent and awe-inspiring that wants to empower you to be more than you've ever been, that wants you to believe in yourself enough to try, to show up for life, and to put as much wisdom and love into it as you can. And when people say things are impossible, or when they try to make God accountable to human reasoning, to be able to giggle and simply allow them their place of growth, while encouraging them to find a sacred space even larger, even more magnificent, even more inspiring. Ultimately, by our thoughts, our words, our songs, our actions, sacred space can be anywhere we are, and God's presence can flow through any one of us. It is only our perception, I believe, that keeps us from realizing it. If there is love, God is most likely there. If there is awe, God is most likely there. What does that mean in our lives? You decide. Thank you very much for joining me today.